So I think what I wanted to start with is trying to give us like an understanding of like an actual visual of what it's like to be in Cusco as opposed to Lima or something. What is it like? You land in Lima and then you go to Cusco. What is that like? What are you passing through? When you get to Cusco, what's there?
So Peru is divided into these three regions that they say in Peru in Spanish as Costa, Sierra, and Selva. Costa is the coast, the Pacific coast, which is on the western side, and it's basically all desert and dry and sand. And so that's Lima. When you go to Lima, dry, kind of gray city, not the coolest city per se. And then you go east of Lima, east of the coast, and you get to the Sierra, which is the Andean mountains. Really long chain of mountains, largest in South America. I think it has the most peaks, over 6,000 meters of any mountain chain in the world. And so that's kind of all these hidden valleys, all this traditional Quechua speaking peoples that live in these remote valleys. And then you keep going further east, and the Andes slowly dip into the Amazon jungle. The Amazon jungle basin, just huge, thousands and thousands of miles long, all the way basically to the coast on the Atlantic side through Brazil. So if you were to go from Lima to Cusco, there's usually two ways you can arrive, one of which is by plane, which will take you about 45 minutes, and you'll see the dramatic change in landscape. But Cusco as a city, it's located 3,400 meters above sea level, so it's like 13,000 feet, which is why a lot of people get there and they get headaches, they might get a little bit of altitude sickness. It's about twice as high as Denver, Colorado, or even a little bit more. So if you fly in, you come over the desert, you see the desert, and you see it shifting into these beautiful Andean mountain peaks, green, sometimes lush, depending on if it's a rainy or the dry season. Or you can take a transportation. Now the plane ride takes 45 minutes. The transportation by bus usually takes like 24 hours. And if on a map it looks so close, it's probably like from here to DC. The problem is that you have all these switchbacks up and down the Andes, and you're in a developing country, so the infrastructure is not great. The buses are a little bit old, and it's not the best situation, and sometimes can be dangerous depending if it's the rainy season. A lot of mudslides, a lot of problems. So coming into Cusco, you come into this ancient city that's basically built on the ruins of the Incans and potentially pre-Incan empires. And so it was the Incan capital, and you have all these incredibly beautiful, complex stone structures and patterns throughout the city that the city's basically built on. When the Spanish arrived, they sort of built their churches on top of ancient ruins, and the city has since then kind of sprawled out into the countryside, but the historic center and some of the ruins that lie right in the city that are somewhat reminiscent of what you see at Machu Picchu is you're walking by it when you're in the city. So that's Cusco, but again, we're still 1,300 feet high, 3,400 meters, so there's no coffee that grows up there. The agriculture is more quinoa, corn, potatoes, wheat, lots of vegetables, and if you want to go to the coffee growing regions, you have to keep going up the mountains and then kind of drop down into this zone they call the Ceja de Selva, which is the eyebrow of the jungle. So it's not like the lowland jungle, and it's not the high Andean mountains, but it's kind of the eyebrow that sits between the two. So to get there from Cusco, you have to take another 5-hour, more or less, bus ride or car ride, or you can actually get there by train because they have a lot of routes for Machu Picchu, which kind of lies in this zone as well.
Oh yeah, this is like a launching point for Machu Picchu, isn't it?
Cusco is launching, okay. Exactly, yeah. And a lot of other ruins, like the Sacred Valley, a lot of people have maybe heard of that, that lie right next to Cusco. So So to get there, you've got to climb up to about 4,400 meters. Again, maybe 15,000 feet, something around like that. And then you come back down, and as you're coming down, you are approaching the jungle. And so you climb out after you pass over the mountain pass. The landscape starts changing really quickly, 10, 15 minutes. Each 10 or 15 minutes, you're seeing different trees, different species, different birds, different landscape. And you get warmer and warmer and warmer from the cold mountain air. And so as you get into the eyebrow of the jungle, it becomes more lush, more green, more vegetation, more animals, more birds. Peru is just a random side fact, but Peru is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. It has the second most bird species of any country in the world, second to Colombia, which makes these agricultural regions so crucial because they're kind of this buffer zone between Amazon fauna and flora that is being protected by the jungle and human expansion. So you keep going down, then you can find at the higher altitudes passion fruits and avocados, and then bananas and coffee. You go further down, cacao, mangoes, all sorts of everything down there.
Cool. So like to go down this path a little bit more, what is the kind of day-to-day, not the harvesting season, let's just talk day-to-day life experience? Like, are people living in the city and doing that route every day, or are they living isolated from the big city?
Yeah, mostly isolated. So there's people that live in the mountains and they live in the city, or they live in these distant towns in the mountains, and they focus on their town. They focus on farming potatoes and growing their crops and raising their livestock, or they live in the eyebrow of the jungle. They live in this jungle zone where they're focusing on their farm, basically. But there's also smaller cities or smaller towns in this eyebrow of the jungle, this region that grows coffee.
So this is maybe not exactly connected, but in England, you can pass over a hill, and though the language isn't different, the dialect might be different, and certainly no.
Okay.
But like, is there a similar experience here where like you pass over, you go to the other side of this mountain range, and people are speaking a different language?
To a certain extent, actually. So there's the Quechua-speaking people live mostly in the mountains of the Andes, and there's about 14 million Quechua speakers in the world, distributed throughout Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And they've kind of mixed and gone further into the jungle, into regions that have been traditionally more indigenous or tribal. And so in one of these regions, in Cusco, a little bit downriver, so not necessarily where we're growing coffee, but there's some coffee that grows there. On one side of the river is these Quechua-speaking people that obviously they have mixed with Spanish and with other European blood over the years. And then on the other side of the river is this indigenous group called the Machigenga. And so that is indigenous land. And so sort of on one side is indigenous jungle dwellers, and the other side is the Quechua speakers. And there's no real animosity between the two, and you can visit, but it's one of those things where you can't really go after dark, and you kind of have to be invited, especially as a gringo. So, yeah, you can definitely get different languages, different groups of people, but some of the most stark contrasts can be in the landscape itself, because on one side, it'll be lush green forest, and on the other side, it'll just be this grass, this pasture land. And so it's like very interesting dichotomy.
So when you're working there, are you speaking Quechua or are you speaking Spanish?
My Quechua is pretty fluent at this point, so
okay.
No, I'm just kidding. It's a really difficult language. I'm speaking all Spanish. Most of the people speak Spanish. Some of the old people, maybe 60, 70 plus, they speak mostly Quechua or only Quechua. So it's difficult to maintain a conversation with them because my Quechua is very basic. And I remember harvesting with this old man, harvesting his cacao in his farm. And that was really interesting because we couldn't really communicate at all. But you get enough of a communication that it works out. But now most of the people speak either just Spanish or both Spanish and Quechua.
So like, kind of coming out broader for a second, like I'm curious to know, I think we're all curious to know probably, like, what is the state of Peruvian coffee? Because I think it's not a region. When you think specialty, you don't think Peru. Maybe now you're getting that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But it's rare, I think,
Definitely.
to find somebody. You see all sorts of Kenyans and Ethiopians, Colombians, Panamanian
Panamanian
geishas and stuff. You know,
Sure.
so what's going on in Peru? What is it known for, and what are sort of the opportunities of growth and possibilities with Peruvian coffee?
Yeah, good questions. Traditionally, Peru has been a country that produces a decent amount of coffee, not really enough to make any impact on global supply, like a Colombia or Brazil or Vietnam, but enough to, produce a decent amount, but not really going to make a change in terms of the market. And they've always been traditionally a country that grows organic coffee and fair trade coffee, and they kind of took advantage of all of these certifications to improve farmer livelihood in the late 70s and 80s. And it was kind of this boom to their agricultural economy because there was interest in farming organic or buying organic coffee, mostly in Europe and the States, and they were all farming organically anyways in Peru. And then the fair trade, also kind of more direct trade. But like you're saying, it wasn't really known as a high quality specialty coffee. Like most of our parents would think of Colombia because, the mountain grown. There was also a certain element of marketing that the Colombians used a lot, and it was very effective, and people knowing that, Colombia, high mountain grown Juan Valdez kind of coffee, whereas Peru didn't really have that. Not to say the Colombian wasn't actually better, because they definitely had more improved infrastructure, and probably the quality was a bit better.
Sorry.
Yeah. So coming past that, Peru, even now, most people, I think, consider it a decent coffee, kind of chocolatey and nutty and earthy and organic, fair trade, but not really super high quality. Like you're saying, you don't have it in the same mind as a Guatemalan or Costa Rican or Panamanian, definitely not like Colombia or the East African coffees with Kenya and Ethiopia. But it definitely is changing, and it's evolving, and the quality, the potential is there, because they have crazy high altitudes, up to 24, even 2,500 meters, which is pretty unseen throughout the coffee world, outside of maybe Ethiopia rivals it, certain places in Bolivia. And old varietals, so you can find old tree stock, basically stock of the tree, of Típica, Bourbon, Caturra, these old world varietals that tend to produce higher quality, more interesting, more complex flavors in the coffees. And you can find a lot of these old trees in Peru. And they have an abundance of natural spring water, natural mountain crystalline streams that grow that flow through their lands. And so there's easy way to wash the coffees and produce really clean washed coffees.
This is actually kind of a good natural segue into another question I was hoping to get to, so when I'm roasting your Peruvian and I'm roasting next batch is like Kenyan, right? And they actually roast really similarly. And I think that has probably a lot to do with size of bean, density, and how high it's grown. However, the coffee tastes completely different. I would expect this to be something to do with the variety of the actual strain of Arabica that's going on there. But would you say that there's more to that equation? Why does Kenya produce a dark purpley fruit coffee at the same altitude as a Peruvian chocolatey, buttery, nutty coffee?
Yeah, great question. I honestly, I think there's a lot of theories. We don't really know 100% why, and there's a lot of reasons why certain coffees may taste different. And I think when it comes to the coffee, like you're saying, the varietal is going to be really important. In Kenya, they grow specific varietals like the SL 28 and 34, which are going to have similar flavor characteristics. And in Peru, you'll have different varietals, like I said, the Típico or the Bourbon. So that's going to be a factor for sure. Other factors are the terroir. So terroir is this French term that's an aggregate of all of the conditions, environmental conditions in which a specific good is grown. It's used traditionally in the wine world. And so it's the soil microbiology of the soil, the composition of the soil, the type of wind patterns and the sunshine and the angles of the slopes and all of these intricate inputs that each have slightly different effect on the end quality. So that's going to make a difference as well. And then we go to process, which the Kenyans are kind of famous for utilizing a specific process in their coffees to create really clean coffees, very crisp acidity, fine acidity, which is basically they're doing sort of a double fermentation process or even a triple fermentation, depending on how you look at it. And we can get more into that later, but I think all of those factors together will produce distinct results in each country. Another thing, I don't know how much this actually affects overall flavor profile, but in Kenya, the soils are traditionally very, very infertile, and so there's a heavy amount of chemical fertilizers that are used. And so I don't know if utilizing those chemical fertilizers may create more uniform flavors overall, or maybe something about the soil being slightly more infertile allows the fruits to be stressed.
I mean, just to add to that, and I have not been to either of these places, so I could be completely wrong, but my idea of like the highlands of Kenya or the highlands of Ethiopia is ancient, old soil. Like these are old volcanoes, right? And a place like Peru, Colombia, I'm thinking new kind of fresh life, like really vibrant, fertile.
Interesting. Yeah, you might be right. I don't know, honestly. I think parts of Ethiopia probably have really lush, dense organic matter in the soil. I think Kenya tends to be a little bit more rocky and sandy. Okay. Although there's probably some volcanic soils, and it probably depends as well where you are. In Peru, they kind of have a little bit of everything. There's some zones that are a lot more dry, a lot more rocky or clay, and other zones that have a lot more high organic matter, even some volcanic zones, and have more humidity in the soil. So there's a range even within these countries. I think sometimes we get bogged down by these political borders of the countries. So we think Peruvian coffee, anything that's grown in Peru tastes like that. Anything that's grown in Ecuador tastes like this, or Colombia like this. But the world, the microbiology of the soil, they don't really care which country they're in. So in the north of Peru, right on the border with Ecuador, and very similar climate to Colombia, the coffees are going to probably taste more like the coffees from southern part of Ecuador, certain parts of Colombia. Whereas in southern Peru, it's very distinct and quite different. So the coffees might taste more similar, maybe even more similar to coffees from Bolivia. So, yeah.
Okay, I just want to ask one small question before we go into the weeds of like actually digging into the processing of the coffee.
Yeah.
But something that I'm fascinated with and something I try and talk to people about is the idea of varietal in coffee. Because with apples, like in the 80s and 90s, you would go to, not that I am aware of this, but I heard a podcast, so I know everything now about apple. Anyways, but essentially before this wave of all these different types of apples you can buy, you would go into a store and you'd buy a green, you'd buy a yellow, or you'd buy a red. And they were mostly mealy, like you never got any like snappy, crisp, sweet apples, right? And then, blah blah. All this stuff happened. The University of Minnesota created the Honeycrisp apple, which is like what Planet Money was saying, that the Honeycrisp apple is actually the highest selling product in almost any market. Period. Of all the products that they have in a market, the Honeycrisp sells the most volume.
Wow.
Like units, right? Which is amazing to think about. But I think that we don't think about that with... I mean, specialty people do. And sorry to say that, but like when you go to Starbucks, they're still caught on like 100% Arabica. Well, at this point, it's like, yeah, duh.
Right.
So you're just selling me a red apple. I know it's red. Like, I want a Honeycrisp or I want a Pink Lady. So I mention this because if Peru, your farming partners growing Típica, had exactly the same process as the Kenyans and exactly the same terroir with a Típica as opposed to an SL28, it still would not taste the same at all, right?
Yeah, without a doubt.
Okay.
Yeah, so varietal will definitely drastically change the flavor profile of the coffee, and to differing degrees. Differing degrees depending on the specific microclimate, because some climates and some soils prefer different varietals. So maybe in one soil Bourbon will be better, and another soil Típica might be better. And it also depends on the process. So some coffees are better processed specific ways. So in general, I agree with what you're saying with the varietals, and especially with the apples being different. At the same time, I think we've narrowed by a wide margin our genetic diversity of apples. So now you go into the store and there's like 8 apple varietals. I don't know exactly how many. Whereas in the past, you could go to a farm and each farm has specifically distinct varietals. So an interesting thing with apples is you harvest an apple and they have seeds in it. You plant the seeds and almost 100% of the time you're going to arrive at a new, distinct, different varietal by planting the seed. Which is why all these varietals of Honeycrisp apples and Fuji, Macintosh, those are basically all grafted. So you want the same exact genetic content to be producing your next apple tree. Coffee, on the other hand, is self-pollinating. So if you have one Típica coffee plant, and I take the fruit of it, and there's usually 2 seeds in the fruit, and I plant that, 95 to 98% of the time, I'm going to get a Típica coffee tree. That's a genetic match of the parent tree. So it's a little bit, in that respect, all the genetic diversity lies in East Africa, and specifically in Ethiopia. And so that's why all these heirloom old varietals are in Ethiopia that tend to have just super interesting and different flavor notes and profiles to them. Whereas in Peru and throughout Latin America, there was kind of one tree, one genetic, really small genetic family that kind of populated all of the coffee in Latin America. So
the Típica.
Típica, yeah. And since then, like, it does mutate and it develops different varietals throughout the years. And you can even see if you plant kind of a field of just Catimor or just Típica or just Bourbon, you'll have most of the trees looking exactly the same. And then there'll be a few that are a little bit taller, a little bit shorter, a little bit wider, a little bit different color of the fruit, different color leaves. And so those are kind of these weird mutations or cross-pollinations that happen due to insects or winds that create new varietals. So even Bourbon and Típica and Pacas or Maragogipe, all these random coffee varietals, they all still came from Típica and kind of either mutated or cross-pollinated with different varietals.
And they all came just for those that don't know. And it's way more complex than what I'm about to say.
And what I'm saying right now, this is still very surface level, I feel like.
But like, the only region in the world that coffee has historically grown naturally without any influence by humans is in Ethiopia. And in fact, it's the same valley, from what I understand, that they found. This is just a tidbit. Don't know how connected this is, but Lucy, that like ancient Homo sapien ancestor of ours. Not that it's connected, but so we wouldn't even know what varietal Typica came from, and they would know. I mean, when you buy an Ethiopian coffee, you look at varietal, and 100% of the time, unless it's grown in a geisha specific farm, where geisha grew naturally, it will say heirloom varietals, because it's thousands. It grows wild, from what I understand, still on the side of the street.
Definitely.
On the
roads. And they haven't genotyped it. They haven't figured out which varietals which. I think they're just starting to think about that.
Infrastructure, from what I understand, is not terribly good either.
Yeah.
But anyways, to just jump now into the processing, can you just give us a brief overview, or an overview, however long you want to take, of how the coffee goes from perhaps seed to maybe roasting? Because we saw the roasting.
Cool. Yeah, definitely.
And then we saw it go into the cup. So after you talk, we will have experienced the entire life cycle of the coffee.
Yeah. So coffee is a fruit of a tropical tree or bush, and so I've got a few things here that will help us see. There's a bunch of different processing methods that we can use to basically separate out the seeds of this tropical fruit and roast the seeds, because the seeds are what we're looking for in terms of roasting. So the first way, and kind of the more traditional ancient way in Ethiopia and throughout Yemen and the first places of cultivation, even throughout I think the early 1800s, was always natural processed coffee. So you harvest the fruit on the tree, and then you dry it right away without touching any water, without any contact with anything, just straight drying the fruit. So kind of like if you were to have a dried cherry or a dried fig, date, I don't know, something like that. Yeah, raisin.
Herb. Yeah.
And so this is a natural processed coffee, or dry processed coffee. Dry because it doesn't touch any water. And from this, then we'll be extracting the usually 2 seeds per fruit. Sometimes there's 1, sometimes there's 3, depending. And that's kind of the old traditional simple method of processing coffee. Raisiny, it's kind of got intense fruit notes to it.
Sorry, that one's on you, so that one's the most important.
Okay, yeah, I agree. I'm just kidding.
Okay, great. No, it's working.
Cool. Yeah, so that's the natural process. Generally the easiest, depending on your climatic conditions where you're harvesting, because you definitely need a lot of sunlight, a lot of heat, and so it kind of has this raisiny...
Can we pass this?
Absolutely. Let's pass that around. And feel free to smell it.
Is that a bean with the fruit dried around it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the fruit with the 2 beans in it. The 2 beans, which are really seeds. We call them beans just because...
Really pits, aren't they?
Pits, yeah, exactly.
Would you call them pits?
Is it on a
The
track?
pit isn't a cherry.
Right. I would call it a seed, but I don't know what the technical definition of a pit is. Do you know that?
Because you can plant a pit, too. To
Definitely.
grow the tree.
Well, pits are seeds.
Yeah.
Oh, there.
So maybe it just is a seed.
I mean, yeah, it's definitely
Seed
a
is
seed. Maybe in the subset of seed, it's also a pit. I don't know.
Just the armpit of the seed.
The armpit. There we
Armpit,
go.
yeah. So this is like the traditional old method of processing coffee. And there's actually a few different ways to process the coffee like this, one of which you harvest it when it's super ripe, and one of which is you almost let it dry on the tree. Yeah. And this is kind of a specific method in parts of Ethiopia where you let it dry and it's kind of becoming a sun-dried tomato on the vine, and then you harvest it. So the part of the drying process has started on the tree. And then you finish it on either a raised bed or a patio. But that's a little bit more difficult because if it rains, that could kind of mess up the drying on the tree. So then the other more traditional way over the past 100 years or so that's become really popular is washed coffees. So with washed coffees, there's a simple machine, hand-cranked machine, or very complex multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars machines that will basically strip the fruit, the coffee fruit, of its skin and part of the mucilage layer, this pulp, this sugary pulp that surrounds it, and just separate out the two beans, the seeds, surrounded by some of the fruit as well that's left over. Then that ferments due to natural bacteria and yeast that's in the air, and will basically, the mucilage will start to break down, the sugars will break down, and after a few hours, anywhere between, depending on the conditions, could be up to 24 hours, 36 hours, 12 hours, they will basically wash the fruit. And so that's a washed coffee. So they'll add water and agitate it in some way so that the mucilage, the pulp, the fruit that has fermented loosens from the skin, from the seeds, and gets washed away. And so that's washed coffee. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that with double fermentations, triple fermentations, different underwater fermentation, without water, with water. And so that's the washed coffee. And it'll produce a completely different flavor profile, a lot cleaner, sometimes a little bit more crisp acidity. And
can you just mention, as we pass this,
Yeah.
like, this could not be roasted?
Not true. It can be roasted.
Okay.
Actually, a lot of the farmers in Peru... So this is called parchment coffee, or in Spanish, pergamino. And so a lot of the farmers will harvest and ferment, wash, and dry their coffee into parchment coffee, and then they'll just simply roast the parchment coffee in a traditional way.
Okay.
It's not going to be super uniform because the parchment will burn a little bit. It's not necessarily ideal for sweetness or for these other characteristics that we're looking for in specialty coffee, but it will produce a good cup of dad coffee. Nice, bitter, traditional, like classic dad coffee, which is what we drink a lot in Peru. And it can be done. It can be done to varying degrees of success.
But you're not seeing, like, any U.S. coffee company roasting parchment.
No U.S. coffee. No real roasters that are roasting parchment coffee. For a bunch of reasons. One of which is the parchment will definitely roast at a different level. It's going to burn. It's going to create different flavors. And then also in the process of removing the parchment, or if we have the natural coffee, removing that outer layer, you will be able to determine if there's any insect damage, if there's any specific damage to the beans, any mushroom or any sort of like fungi that starts to grow on it, and then you can separate it out. Whereas if it's in the parchment, you won't really necessarily see it. Although the insect damage you can sometimes tell.
Okay.
So then we bring the coffee, whether it's dried with the fruit on or just this outer parchment layer, and we'll bring that to a dry mill. And so the dry mill removes this last layer, whether it's the fruit or the parchment, and you get basically a green bean, which is more gray, bluish, depending on the varietal, depending on different factors, and that's basically what we're putting in the roaster. So a couple different ways to go about processing that are somewhat newer are kind of these honey processed coffees, or semi-washed coffees, or different things that involve leaving a certain amount of the fruit on the bean while it's fermenting, while it's drying before you wash it. And there's a bunch of different ways to do it. And yeah, we could get in shortly how you basically produce different honey processed coffees. They're going to involve different levels of time and different amounts of mucilage that you leave on the seed while it's before you dry it. So
quick question before, just not to take this for granted. So there is the natural dry method, right? Then there's the wash method.
Yep.
And then there's this thing that's kind of in between,
Yeah.
sort of, which is this honey
Absolutely.
process that
Yeah.
you're about to talk about.
Yeah, kind of a hybrid
Okay.
per se.
Okay.
So, yeah, natural washed, all the fruit, drying, and there's certain fermentation that happens during drying. And then washed coffee is no fruit on while drying. And so this is in between, a hybrid of the two, like you're saying. It's a good way to put it. Different ways to add to do it are wait specific amounts of time after the harvest before milling it and stripping off that skin. Or letting it ferment a little bit and then washing and then drying with some of the skin on. With some of the fruit on. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. But basically we can get different colors on the parchment while it's dried, and that sort of relates to the kind of honey process, although it's really more complex than that. So you can have yellow honey, red honey, black honey, and these all relate to how much fruit you've basically left on the parchment coffee before you dried it. I know, it's probably very confusing.
This is like a pretty popular method right now. Like with the Roaster's Cup last year, this is what I think it was a honey method Colombian that they had everybody do, and then everybody brought their own. But almost everybody brought a honey process too. And it was crazy. It's so unlike Ethiopia, as he was saying, is known for its natural dry method, which produces, as you've probably tasted, blueberry notes, right? What I get sometimes with some honey process is almost like, I hate to say it, but like Skittle fruit. Like not quite blueberry or cherry or anything, but like a really bright, like almost unnatural fruit flavor.
Mm-hmm. What color Skittle usually?
All of them when you shove
Okay.
a handful in your mouth,
Yeah.
except leaving out the green apple.
Okay, yeah. Take that.
Which, why did they do that?
Yeah, I don't know.
Say Jolly Rancher.
Yeah, that's right.
They
Yeah,
didn't have enough varietals.
yeah, I would say.
Like watermelon.
Yeah.
We had a natural yogurt chef, and it was
Yeah.
watermelon Jolly Rancher.
Actually, back in the day, they used to have like thousands of varietals of Skittles, and throughout the years, they just kind of narrowed that down to just a few. Yeah. So this is like the red honey,
Ooh, damn.
and so a reason why a lot of people are interested in the honey process are, as a farmer, yeah,
It
very
smells
intense.
like prunes or like dates.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Definitely. It definitely has a honey smell to it as well.
Yeah.
Honey. So a lot of the reason why people are interested in the honey is, as a farmer, you only have a few different ways to change the flavor of your coffee. So one of it is you improve the harvest and you improve the processing. Another one is you plant a different varietal, which takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort. And the other one is you sell your farm and you buy another farm in a different region. But let's say I'm a farmer. I've tried to improve my harvest and my processing, but the quality is still just, it's interesting, it's just not amazing. And I don't have enough money to really cut down all my trees and then plant new ones. And I definitely don't have enough money to sell my farm, buy another one in another region. So another way to impart different flavors are to do some sort of natural or a honey processed coffee, because you're basically adding flavors that are somewhat extrinsic to the soil itself, to the region, the terroir, and you're adding flavors that could potentially make it a little bit more complex, a little bit sweeter, fruitier, more interesting, let's say. So that's kind of why it's become a little bit more popular. And plus, yeah, it does have interesting flavors, and you can get some amazing coffees with the honey.
So now it's processed, it's drying, it's in parchment form.
Yeah.
But the wet mill,
Yeah.
where all that's happening, is different than the dry mill, by and large.
Definitely. Completely different machine.
So what happens then?
So after it's dried in the parchment, then we pass it through another machine, which creates, it's basically a cylinder, and it creates friction where the parchment will be basically grinded up against each other, and it needs to be a specific level of dry. You can't have it kind of wet. It's got to be dry. It can't have much more than 13 or 14% humidity.
Okay.
And ideally for export, you want 12 maximum. A lot of people want 10% humidity of the beans. So it creates friction, and the friction heats up to a certain level. You don't want it really to heat up at all, but it heats it up a little bit, and it creates friction that breaks off this outer parchment layer. So if I grab this one right here. Another way that we kind of test coffee in the origin is to smell it, but then we can also sort of recreate that process that the machine does kind of in our hands. So we will kind of grind it up like that, and then we'll start blowing off the parchment layer to it to arrive at the green coffee. So that's basically what the big machine does, is it creates friction, and it grinds and removes that outer skin layer, outer parchment layer. And then from there, there's a bunch of other processes that happen in the dry mill, which include screening the coffee, so separating out different sizes, and those sizes depend on the region, the country, and what you're looking for. And then you can also pass it through what they call a gravimetric machine, or a table that basically separates based on density or the weight of the coffee. And then you can also do some hand sorting, or you can do a machine. You pass the beans one layer at a time through a machine that shoots a jet of air when you encounter any color that's different. And so these machines are really expensive machines, but it's dropping one bean at a time, very fast rate. And if they see something the color's different, whether it's a little red or it's black or it has a white from a fungal growth on it, it will shoot a jet of air out and it'll blow that away. And so you're interested in arriving at a specific amount of defects per 300 grams. And there's different levels that you want. But those processes are all to create a more uniform product to a certain degree that can be roasted in a more uniform way. Because if we were just to take the parchment coffee, just dry mill it and give it to you, there's going to be beans of totally different sizes. There might be beans with a lot of insect damage. There might be beans that have been chipped by the wet mill. And so you get a lot of anomalies that will lead to defects in the cup, in the flavor of the coffee.
So just to finish up this thing,
Yeah.
I want you to talk, if you're willing, a little bit about what you do that's different than, well, or just what you do in general.
Yeah.
And how you see it being different from what a large importer, exporter like Genuine Origin or Royal or Cafe Imports is doing.
Mm-hmm. So I'm basically working and living directly with farmers in Peru. And so I kind of get a sense of what the daily life is like. I enjoy living there. So I'm able to develop direct connections with farmers and basically harvest with all of these farmers that I'm working with, and work with them on different processing methods and do workshops with small groups of farmers and travel around. And the idea is that more than anything, I'm trying to connect these farmers more directly to the market, because most of these farmers, they don't, at least the farmers I'm working with and the farmers living in this region, they don't really have connection much to the internet. They don't really know anything about where their coffee's going or the greater global coffee market. And maybe for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, they've kind of just been selling their coffee and just getting screwed a little bit by someone. And that someone has to make money, and that someone is adding value to a certain degree because they're transporting the product closer to where it's being consumed. But the traditional way is not necessarily in a fair and balanced way for the farmers, who are really the ones that are working to create the coffee. So the idea is to first of all educate the farmers on what the global coffee market is, what is specialty coffee, what's the difference in prices, why they might be interested in it, what the varietals that they might need for that, what the processing methods. And my idea is that they should have the decision. What do they focus on? because not all of them are going to want to spend tons of time harvesting just the ripest cherries, the ripest fruit, and processing it perfectly and trying to create a perfect coffee. Some of them might not want to do that. I'm not here to say, oh, you need to harvest like this because the people in America like nice, sweet, acidic coffee, you know? I'm just saying, if you want to do that, that's an option that's available, and this is the difference in the price that you could see potentially. And just like usually these farmers can't connect directly with a roaster or even an exporter generally, even if it's through a cooperative. There's certain problems with the cooperative system. There's things they do really well, but not always. Most of the roasters in the U.S., they're running a full-time business, and it's hard to go to another country, taste a lot of coffees, try and find a farmer directly to work with. It's difficult. So my idea is that just like the roasters don't have the easiest time finding farmers in remote valleys in the Andean jungle, the farmers don't have an easy time finding the roasters. So my idea is, more than anything, is to create a direct connection and a dialogue between farmers and roasters, and trying to be as transparent as possible with all of the farming practices, all of the payments that are made between the two groups, and trying to create more of an equitable relationship. Because for hundreds of years, almost thousands of years, there's been a disequity in terms of goods coming from one place, money going to the other place, but it's not really in alignment with what we believe our values are. And so more than anything, that's what I'm trying to promote, and helping farmers improve the quality if they're interested in that. Most of the farmers that are interested, because they can kind of see the market changing, they can kind of see that this could be something that's useful, and everyone thinks they have good coffee. Oh, I've got super high altitude. I think I could produce really good coffee. So most of them are pretty excited about it, and then it's just about helping, more than anything, first just tasting the coffee, just how they're preparing it. And then maybe doing a couple trial runs. All right, let's try to harvest it like this. Let's try to ferment it like this. Let's try to dry it like this. And let's try to store it in optimal conditions, and then taste the coffee. And so depending on the improvement in quality or the overall quality that they're reaching, they can sometimes see maybe twice as much money that they could be making if they're producing high quality coffee. And so even though it's a little bit more work, it's definitely worth their time. So for me, one element is definitely economic. They might improve their house. They might give it to their kid who's going to university in Cusco. They might use it for whatever kind of improvement they want in their own lifestyle. Almost more than the economic benefit, I think, is the emotional and psychological effect that it has on farmers that are finally proud and excited about what they're doing. So I remember going to regions, and the farmers, they just don't have a lot of animo in Spanish. It's like they're not very animated, they're not very excited about what they're doing, because they're kind of in this cycle that they've been for a while. And it's not super exciting, and they look at the harvest as like this labor that they have to do. And then, there's the potential with connecting with the roaster. There's gringos on my land. I've never seen a gringo before, and like he wants to harvest with me. What's going on? And so they see it. They're like, okay, maybe I do have good quality coffee, and maybe I can think of this as more of like I'm a craftsman, and I have more excitement when I'm harvesting the coffee, and I'm more proud to be what I'm doing, to do what I'm doing. And there's this certain level of pride of being a farmer, of connecting directly with someone like yourself who's roasting coffee. And so that's kind of the ideal marriage between economic benefit, but also this mental, psychological, and emotional benefit of just being happy doing what you're doing, being excited, being motivated. And potentially, like last year I was in Peru, and a roaster came down from the States, and he came and visited the farmer that he bought the coffee from last year through me. And that was just really cool to see them meet each other, even though the farmer didn't speak English, the roaster didn't really speak Spanish, but when they met, it was just like the universal language that was able to come through.
And as a sort of side note, I remember texting you when I was at SCA in Seattle, and like I haven't been to Origin yet, and I will hopefully this year.
Yeah, come on now.
But I didn't get to meet Benigno, but I met your friend who runs Cayuno and Edwin and a couple other farmers that you had given me samples of, and I was with my friend Kat, who speaks fluent Spanish, and it was like that meeting them. I can't quite explain it except it was like that heart excitement when you're like reading an acceptance letter into university or something, right? And you got in, you're like, oh my god, like I roasted your coffee.
Yeah.
Like, we don't get to meet you. This doesn't happen.
Right.
And they probably don't get, and they
Definitely
were
not.
so excited. They Peru, so all these countries will set up little areas, and they're huge, these areas. Kenya, especially countries that have money. Kenya's was gorgeous. Peru's was beautiful. And they set up these booths, essentially, with like meeting tables for roasters bigger than myself. And at the time, I had no ambition of like buying a bunch of coffee from them. So that was my only sack that I got, half of that even from you for like helping you out with your Kickstarter. But my point was like they sat me down and like gave me all these pamphlets and were like taking notes on like, so where are you in the States? Like how, like what do you want to do with our coffee? Like how can we help you? And like what can you do for us too? You know?
Yeah. How many containers are you gonna buy?
Yeah, they asked that, and I'm like, none. Sorry. One sack, please. I felt like a fraud, but I had to do it, and they didn't care. They were super excited, and everybody's snapping pictures and like. Anyways, just wanted to add that.
For sure. Yeah, it's really cool when you can see on their face the excitement. Let's hear.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, how many of these farmers actually like drink their coffee and like their coffee?
Good question. I was just about to get into that. That's good.
Because I remember watching this documentary about chocolate. And, like, the farmers had never eaten like chocolate, and so like the presenter gave like one of them a Kit Kat, and like they blew their mind because they like tasted chocolate for the first time.
Yeah.
So like, what is it? I know coffee's a lot easier to make than a Kit Kat. So what's the?
Yeah, actually, I had a very similar experience with chocolate and cacao because I also work with that.
Yeah.
So, but first with the coffee, I would say most of the farmers drink their own coffee. The problem is they mostly drink the crappy coffee they have. So what will happen with the washed coffee? Basically, 99% of the coffee in Peru is washed coffee. When you're washing it, some coffee will float, and when you're using a channel to basically separate out the densities, some of the coffee will be lighter, less dense, and generally of lower quality, and will be kind of washed to one side or down the channel, whereas the high quality dense coffee will be stored separately. Most of the farmers are drinking that crappy coffee that never gets exported, and most of them are, at least in Peru, they're roasting it by a fire on in a clay pot and kind of moving it, and they have it, and they roast it mostly with the parchment on. And to add insult to injury, most of the farmers in Peru roast it either with some citrus rind. It could be orange, which actually could be interesting. Could add some interesting acidity and citrus notes. And then at the end, they throw sugar into it and basically caramelize and burn sugar onto it. And so, aside from
probably to mask the
actually, there's a couple reasons. Aside from the obvious potential carcinogenic properties that burning sugar has, what it does is it when they make the coffee, it basically passes dark black, and so they look at coffee as like some black liquid. So they want to be able to basically brew that coffee 4 or 5 times, and by the end it's still coming out really dark, but it's only coming out dark because they burnt sugar on it instead of coming out dark because it's actually coffee. So a lot of the farmers are drinking low quality coffee. That's maybe not even coffee, it's just burnt sugar. So I would say most of the farmers are doing something like that, or just not drinking the coffee. Some farmers, every now and then, actually one of the farmers, I remember going to meet her, and she, I think in 2012, had won some sort of regional award and went to Lima, which is like a big thing for these farmers to go to the capital city. Most of the farmers have never been to Lima, which is pretty wild because, yeah, I mean, you'll meet random people in Boston and I was in Lima, or I was in Cusco, and like these farmers that's from there, they've never been to Lima. So she had won some competition and went to Lima, and she came back, and I visited her on the farm, and she was roasting, still kind of in a traditional method, but she was doing like a light roast, and she was doing with the just green bean, not any parchment coffee. And she roasted it really well, and then she had a V60, which is crazy.
Did you have a gooseneck?
I think she did, honestly, yeah. So she boiled water, poured it in the gooseneck, and then basically prepared this like specialty coffee on her farm in the middle of the Amazon. And so that was awesome because first of all, you never see the farmers taking interest in how the consumers are drinking their coffee.
Yeah.
And then also she enjoyed it, you know, she was like interested in the flavors and everything. And she was probably in her early 60s. So
wow.
like she's hip, she knows what's good, and she had amazing coffee to drink. And then there's kind of in between where some of the farmers will make decent coffee, and it's decent in terms of a US specialty thing. Again, it's like the dad coffee, like most people probably enjoy it because it's a little bit bitter, it's just strong, bold, you know, fresh coffee. And so the last year I was down in 2017, I kind of took it upon myself to try and educate the farmers a little bit and be like, you have amazing coffee, man. Don't burn it. Don't put the sugar in. Let's roast it up in your traditional way and do so it tastes amazing and you'll be able to try it. So I was able to do that with a bunch of the farmers and basically teach them how to make delicious coffee. So there's a few different ways that you can basically dry mill the parchment without one of these expensive big machines. One of which is in kind of a hand crank grinder, and another one they basically put it in this old motorcycle tube. They cut it open, they put the coffee in it, and they basically whack it against the stone, and it breaks it up, and then you come in and you pour it out, and you just get green coffee. So you roast that, and we're basically roasting it, and you want to move the coffee around pretty consistently, pretty frequently, so it doesn't burn on any side. Again, it's not like one of these drum roasters.
The battery is low, but it stopped recording. I don't know what the button is.
Cool.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. So they're roasting. I was doing most of the roasting because I have a decent amount of experience in this traditional way. And you want to move it around quickly. It's not going to be like the drum roaster, which roasts pretty evenly. But still, you can get a decent coffee. You still get the crack. And you move it around. You pour it out of the clay pot. And you try to cool it as quick as possible. And then we'll grind it by hand right there. And then brew it. And you get really delicious flavors. And the farmers, like the face on the farmers, they've never tasted their coffee like that. Because it's sweet. And they always say chuma, which is in Quechua. It's like, oh, it's gross. It's not sweet. It needs sugar. And they always put tons of sugar in their drinks. So they taste it and they're like, oh my gosh, this is good. This doesn't even need sugar, which is ideal. Is what we're looking for.
It's weird, isn't it? It's sort of the same experience that people have here.
Yeah.
After drinking Starbucks or Pete's or Folgers or something.
Yeah.
You give them a cup of specialty coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the same experience.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, it tastes sweet. You're like, oh my gosh.
And
so
do they cup?
The farmers, at least in this region of Cusco, don't cup. I've met some farmers in the north who are actually like putting in cupping labs on their farms. That's a totally different deal. And they usually, they have more infrastructure, better transportation, generally larger farms. But in this area of Cusco, virtually none of the farmers cup. Actually, a few of the farmers were like, yeah, well, how do you do this cupping? I don't understand. Like, I told them, they're like, oh, interesting. I thought there was like a machine that you put it in and it like comes out like 86, 85, you know, like with the score. So it's like they have no idea. And they're like always, for some of these coffee competitions, there'll be like regional competition. They'll submit their coffee and they'll be waiting for the results, like super excited. And I reached like 87 coffee. Like, that's so exciting, you know? But yeah, they're so removed from that way of determining quality. And so some farmers are now coming to the labs and learning more about that and getting interested. But an interesting thing with the roasting of the coffee is usually there's these regional district-wide fairs, agricultural fairs, where people will bring their tuber vegetables, their bananas, their citrus fruits, their mangoes, their papayas, everything they'll bring with their coffee and their cacao, everything they'll kind of bring to one day a year, the municipality's anniversary. And they'll have a big fair, there'll be music, there'll be all sorts of events and stuff. And one of the events that they have is usually a roasting challenge, coffee roasting challenge. And so I've been the judge for a couple of these roasting challenges. So what they do is they get a couple cinder blocks and there might be 5 or 6 people. Usually you have women and men, and they'll have 5 or 6 women compete against each other and 5 or 6 men compete against each other. And what they'll do is they'll set up the cinder blocks in one of these clay pots. They'll stoke a wood fire, and then we'll give each of them maybe a half a kilo to roast, a half a kilo of the same green coffee to roast. They pick their stick out, they find a good stick, and they will start roasting. We time it, and whoever has the best technique and the most uniform color of coffee, the best color of coffee, they kind of win the prize. And usually the women are better than the men, to be honest, because they're just more adept at roasting the coffee. But it's interesting because there are more and more farmers that are becoming interested in tasting their own coffee. And even I've had a few farmers that were saying, they were like, oh yeah, which one's my best coffee? I was like, oh yeah, this, like, your second and third harvest were really high quality. First harvest, not as much. And the last harvest is of mixed quality. So they're like, okay, cool, I'm going to save some of that for myself. And which is awesome, because I like to see the farmers drinking their best quality. Because then it gets them thinking, like, this tastes good. I know why it tastes good. And I know all that extra work with the harvesting really paid off in terms of the quality.